A major landslide is threatening Sicily a week after extreme weather swept through the Italian city.
What if I told you a town in Sicily isn't being destroyed by an earthquake? Not by a volcano, not by a tsunami, but by something quieter, something slower, something that doesn't explode. It creeps. Right now, in southern Sicily, the ground beneath a hillside community is failing. Cracks have opened in roads, buildings have been evacuated. Entire sections of slope have begun to collapse downward, carving a widening scar across the landscape. And the most unsettling part is this: the disaster isn't over. Because landslides don't always strike in a single moment. Sometimes they keep moving. Today, we're breaking down the landslide evacuation unfolding right now in Sicily, what's happening beneath the town, why the earth can collapse without any shaking at all, and why this may be one of the most dangerous kinds of geological disasters on the planet. A collapse happening in slow motion. Welcome back to the channel. This is where we cover geology as breaking news, because the ground beneath us is not as permanent as we think. The earth shifts, it fractures, it fails. And sometimes, entire communities are forced to flee, not because of what they can see, but because of what's happening underneath them. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a hillside can begin to slide, why rainfall can destabilize an entire town, what progressive collapse really means, and why events like this are becoming more common around the world. Because this story is bigger than Sicily. Almost every major landslide begins the same way, not with a roar, but with a whisper, a thin crack in pavement, a curb that suddenly looks uneven, a door that stops closing properly. At first, people assume it's normal settling, buildings settle, roads shift, nothing feels urgent. But then the cracks widen, walls begin splitting, streets deform, the ground no longer looks solid. And that's when the terrifying realization sets in. It's not just the building moving, it's the earth. In this Sicily event, officials reported growing instability along the slope, leading to evacuations as a precaution. Because once a hillside begins to move, it rarely stops neatly. It moves in blocks, huge sections of ground slowly detaching like pieces of a breaking plate. And that creates one of the most dangerous situations imaginable. A town sitting on land that is no longer stable. Now, when most people hear the word landslide, they picture a sudden avalanche of mud, fast, violent, dramatic. But here's the part most people don't realize. The most destructive landslides are often not fast at all. Landslides come in many forms: rockfalls, debris flows, mudslides, slow earth creep, rotational slumps. And what appears to be happening in Sicily is not one single collapse. It's a broader slope failure, an entire section of hillside weakening over time, breaking loose gradually, then potentially accelerating without warning. And that's what makes this so dangerous. The disaster isn't a moment, it's a process. Sicily is one of the most geologically complex places in Europe. It sits near the boundary where the African tectonic plate converges with Eurasia. That tectonic collision is why the island has earthquakes, fractured terrain, and active volcanoes like Mount Etna. But the landslide risk here isn't only tectonic. It's something more subtle. The ground itself. Much of Sicily contains soft sedimentary layers, ancient marine deposits, weathered rock, clay-rich soils, terrain that was laid down over millions of years when this region was once seafloor. Beautiful landscapes. But fragile foundations. These slopes can remain stable for decades, until conditions change. And the most important material here is clay, because clay behaves almost like a trap. Dry clay can be strong, but when clay becomes saturated with water, its strength collapses. It becomes slick. It becomes unstable. And gravity takes over. In landslide science, one trigger appears again and again: water, rainfall, storm saturation. Because when rain infiltrates the soil, it fills the pore spaces between grains, increasing something called pore-water pressure. And pore-water pressure is one of the most dangerous forces a hillside can experience. Because slope stability relies on friction holding everything in place. But rising water pressure reduces that friction. It pushes grains apart, it weakens the hillside from within. It's like the entire slope becomes lubricated underground. Here's a simple analogy. Imagine heavy books stacked on a tilted table. They stay in place because friction resists motion. Now pour oil between them. Suddenly, they slide. That is exactly what water can do beneath a hillside. Once friction drops below a critical threshold, gravity wins. The slope begins to move. And here's what makes this even scarier. A slope doesn't always fail during the storm. Sometimes it fails days later, because water keeps seeping downward, deeper and deeper, pressurizing weak layers until the entire hillside reaches a tipping point. One of the strangest parts of landslide disasters is that the ground can suddenly appear to sink, not because of a sinkhole, but because of rotational slumping. In a rotational slump, a massive block of hillside slides along a curved surface. As it moves, the upper part sinks and cracks open, the middle rotates, and the lower section bulges outward. This creates steep scarps, cliff-like break zones that look like the earth has dropped vertically. But it isn't falling straight down, it's sliding and rotating downhill. And here's where it gets terrifying. If that slump grows, the failure zone can migrate uphill. That means areas that look safe today may not be safe tomorrow. This is what makes slow landslides uniquely dangerous. They evolve, they expand. This is called progressive failure. One fracture forms, that changes stress in surrounding ground. Water enters new cracks, more blocks loosen. The failure spreads. It's like tearing fabric. Once the tear begins, it rarely stays contained. That's why evacuations happen early, because slow movement can turn into rapid collapse if a key section gives way. And geology isn't the only factor. Human infrastructure can add stress, added weight from buildings, drainage concentration from paved roads, excavation removing slope support, leaking underground pipes saturating soils, vegetation loss reducing root reinforcement. Humans don't create every landslide, but development can push fragile terrain closer to failure. Sometimes towns are built on slopes that were always unstable. They just hadn't failed yet. So what happens when a landslide threatens a town? Emergency response focuses on three things. First, protect lives. Evacuations are the top priority because buildings can fail without warning when the ground beneath them moves unevenly. Second, monitor movement. Scientists use GPS deformation sensors, drones, radar, and satellite INSAR imaging. Satellites can detect even centimeter-level motion across an entire hillside, revealing whether the slope is accelerating. Third, manage water. Since water is often the trigger, mitigation may include rerouting runoff, pumping excess water, improving drainage, sealing cracks, and reinforcing weak zones. But here is the hard truth. Some slopes cannot be quickly stabilized. Sometimes the only safe option is relocation, and that raises the biggest question of all. Could this become catastrophic? Yes. Slow landslides can suddenly accelerate if water pressure spikes, if the toe collapses, or if heavy rainfall continues. A slow slide can transform into a debris flow, and debris flows can move faster than you can run. That's why authorities treat events like this as active hazards, not finished disasters. Even if movement is slow now, the risk can change overnight, and Sicily is not alone. This evacuation fits a global trend. Landslide risk is rising worldwide due to stronger rainfall extremes, expanding hillside development, aging infrastructure, and land use change. Earthquakes strike instantly. Volcanoes erupt dramatically. But landslides, they whisper, they crack, they creep, and then suddenly, they take everything. So what happens next for Sicily? The outcome depends on whether the slope stabilizes or continues moving. Some areas may be reinforced, some zones may remain restricted for years, and some places may never be safely rebuilt, because geology does not always allow restoration. Sometimes the landscape has already changed permanently, and finally, there are warning signs everyone should know if they live near slopes. New widening cracks in walls or pavement, doors and windows suddenly sticking, leaning trees or fences, water emerging where it never did before, bulging ground at the base of a hill, rumbling sounds during heavy rain. Early recognition saves lives. And that brings us to the real message of this story. What's happening in Sicily is a reminder that disasters don't always arrive with fire, or shaking, or an explosion. Sometimes they arrive with a crack, with slow movement, with gravity pulling on weakened ground. The earth doesn't need to erupt, or quake, to reshape a town, because the ground beneath us is not permanent. It is alive. It is shifting. And sometimes, it reminds us that we are only ever guests on its surface. So if you want more real-time geology coverage, volcanoes, earthquakes, landslides, subscribe and stay ready. Because the planet beneath you is always moving.